Okay. I guess I'm shouting right now.
You're perfect.
Okay, my name is Gicheru, as Ben has said. I have been a journalist for more than 30 years. I left journalism to start working with a civic technology company. Not company really, it's actually an organization. It's an initiative in Africa called Code for Africa. And I co-founded a fact-checking organization called PesaCheck. Really, just like Laura, I kind of got concerned about the misinformation that was coming through, especially when it comes to dealing with money. I then left that and started another initiative, which is where I am the director of, where I'm working with women journalists, essentially trying to see how we can use not only technology, but how we can report better on the issues that matter to women and girls, because they tend to be put on the back burner in most of our newsrooms. And prior to that, I was a founding editor of the Star, which is one of the newspapers in Kenya. So that's a little bit about myself.
Perfect.
Yeah,
So,
the
go on.
reason why I'm interested in this conversation is because I think we can use technology to kind of amplify some of the stuff that are of interest and of concern to women, because we never get featured in most of our stories, or most of our media tends to ignore the issues of interest to women. So for me, it's actually trying to understand whether we can use some of these technologies to try and not only amplify the voices of women, but also kind of put front and center the issues that are of interest to women, because they're not served at all by most of our media. I don't think I'm only talking about Africa, but I think all over the world, when it comes to women and how women are represented, we tend to be incidental to the fact, not really the focus. And mine is to try and figure out, is there ways we can actually use technology to put us, meaning women, and front and center, and so that we can end some of the discrimination that is happening. Thank you.
Brilliant. So as you can see, we have a very experienced panel of folks who have experience in detecting emerging narratives, fact-checking misinformation, and producing quality journalism. And I hope we can draw on that experience today. Last and very much least, my name is Ben Whitelaw. I'm a freelance newsroom consultant. I've worked in digital strategy roles for 10 years, and I write a newsletter about content moderation called Everything in Moderation, which is not very original. I want to give particular thanks to Catherine just for joining us remotely. We would have loved her to be here, but the quarantine rules here in Italy were stacked against her, despite the fact that in the last week there's been more cases of COVID in the UK than there have been in Kenya for over 2 years. So, but that's a slight digression, which I will leave there. So we know why this conversation matters. You've all talked to that in the first remarks, but I wonder if you can share examples of in your careers of humans working in close proximity to machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence, and what it allowed you to do that you couldn't do otherwise. And I'll start with you, Laura.
Okay, so many things. I'm really interested in looking at a room of people who are obviously, I hope, interested in this subject. Who generally thinks that AI is going to help us as journalists and help us in the world to sort of tell the stories we need to tell? Do we have a positive framing from people? Hands up. Okay, a couple. And who thinks it might be negative? Okay, so, right, okay. Okay, and it might well be both, absolutely. It might well be a bit of both. Right, let's get stuck into that then, because one of the first things that I encountered when I moved into technology was the power of personalization. So we have in the BBC, and I guess you must have too, what we call an abundance of content. We have too much stuff for anybody to kind of find their way through. So we thought that we could start to use machine learning driven personalization to help audiences navigate through our content and help it accompany them on their journey, through life, whatever it was on a given day. It's been fiercely contested as an issue by lots of journalists. There are journalists who have worries about us creating filter bubbles and rabbit holes, which it's been borne out in organisations that have used personalisation. But I think there are positives in it, and we're certainly looking at how we can, as a public service organisation, use that personalisation. But the flip side of that, and you're absolutely right, there are always going to be two sides to this, is that when you look at things like the social platforms targeting material at you because of your interests, or the likes you've made, or how you've responded, that can lead to to really awful disinformation storms. And so the other thing we're starting to look at is how we can tackle that through a particular project we're looking at, which is through media provenance. So how can we show people where media has come from as just one brick in the wall of trying to fight against disinformation? And we're doing that through a project called Project Origin, which is heavily linked to another project which has been heard about at the festival this week, a project called the Content Authenticity Initiative, and we've joined together under an umbrella organisation to look at open standards around that. So those just two to kick you off with, really, two kind of like contrasting ways in which this technology is fascinating, brilliant, useful and damaging all at the same time.
Brilliant. And Catherine, I want to come to you as well. How have you used kind of the mix of humans and artificial intelligence in your work at PayScheck and Code for Africa?
Okay, just have to put the record straight. I left PayScheck in 2020 to start the Africa Women Journalism Project. So I'm no longer at PayScheck, but I'm still very much interested in how it's been progressing. But before I left, PayScheck towards the end of 2020, actually launched a debunk bot. Essentially, this is a bot that would not really troll, I don't like using the word trolling in this way, but anyway, it would actually get any misinformation that was shared on Twitter, and then it would connect, it would let the person know who has shared or who has put that out to a fact check that had already debunked that claim. And that is how it was being deployed. Unfortunately or fortunately, I think one of the biggest challenges with that is that a lot of the fact checks were not relevant to our space or our time or the issues that were being amplified or people were sharing on Twitter, and therefore the debunks hadn't been made or the fact checks hadn't been made. So the database itself wasn't robust enough to capture a lot of the misinformation and disinformation. Actually, some of it was totally disinformation that was being shared on Twitter. So it ended up having to be human beings, the fact checkers within the PayScheck network, to go in or to try and capture as much of that as they could and try and debunk it. So it wasn't really a very intelligent bot, I have to say, but it was the beginning of trying to utilize artificial intelligence to help us with fact-checking. And the other thing also is that a lot of the fact checks that the database was connected not only to PayScheck debunks, but also other debunks that had been made by other fact-checking organizations within the IFCN network. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know how to, I mean, it's a glass full, half empty, glass half empty. The thing is, a lot of the misinformation that we were seeing, or the claims that we were seeing, only a few had been fact-checked by other external fact-checkers. So again, the number of the fact-checks was very limited. The database was very limited in terms of being able to respond to the claims that were already being done. And we all know the problem of human beings. We do not have the capacity to deal with all the nonsense that is out there. So in as much as PayScheck and the network and its team were trying to keep ahead of the claims, there are quite a number that kind of fell through the cracks and kind of got dispersed or shared far and wide. And then also the thing is, with the debunk bot was only for Twitter, and in our part of the world, Twitter is not really that popular. So a lot of the misinformation is in WhatsApp, and that is now where you find a lot of it tends to get spread and very little gets attended to, or very few people can actually see it. And that again was another challenge when it comes to using AI or debunk bots or bots like that. That is what we were using at the time, or which was used at the time. I will stop there until I give a chance to to the next person.
That's
Sorry.
great. No, thank you. That's Catherine. That's great. I mean, Mark, your experience at Storyful and now at Kinzen obviously plays in here. What have you found?
So I must start with a cultural comment about technology and journalism, which is we have a profoundly dysfunctional relationship as journalists with technology. Now, it's partly because we talk about being the first draft of history, which for me is such an irrelevance these days. Like, I think our job is to orientate people toward this uncertain future, a time when the only constant is change. And what we tend to happen when we were faced with technology as journalists, we had this cycle of derision, shock, and then hate, right? So Twitter comes along, and we deride it because people are talking about eating their breakfast on Twitter, and then we're shocked when Tahrir Square happens and it's accelerating the Arab uprising, and then it breaks American democracy and we hate it. And we have this learned helplessness about technology. Technology is something that happens to journalists, not the other way around. And for me, the last 12 years of my life has been about trying to evangelize a new relationship in which when we start to think about technology as something that is not magic, but it's just a bunch of recipes. And it's human judgment, not business, not technology, that is a key in all of this. And that brings us back to journalism. The practical applications that I've seen, first of all, working for Twitter. When I was with Storyful, I thought that misinformation was kind of a bug, like a pollutant. The factory was broken, we could fix it. Then I realized not just working for Twitter, but realized it was a systemic design, right? It was basically algorithms primed for an economy based on clicks that was getting us outraged, and that fundamentally we as journalists have a role to play in over the long term making sure that we're building recommender systems that are responding to the best intentions of the users of those systems, not their worst instincts. So that's for me, I think, if I was to set a 10, 15-year challenge, it is for us as the people who can make those editorial judgments, understand language politics to be part of that. But practically where Kinzen has developed its solutions have been around the idea that with fact-checking, open source intelligence, they've never been more necessary, but on their own, they're not sufficient to stop crises developing. We need to be preempting threats. We need to be thinking about possibly what would happen if Taiwan was invaded by China. What's going to happen in the Kenyan elections come, September, October in Bosnia? So what we're trying to do is build research that is essentially journalism, and we're building data sets from the research, which are then used in machine learning classifiers, which can then be applied to multiple different languages, and you rinse and repeat. It becomes a feedback loop. So we can now analyze vast quantities of content by building data sets and transformers, machine learning transformers, which get better at spotting things. So we're responding right now, I think, to the burning fire, which essentially is a kind of pandemic level event with information crises, trying to get to a point where we'll never get rid of these problems. I think I heard you today, Ben, talking about there'll always be information risk, but we want to get from crisis, and that's why we work with these big platforms and technology companies, content moderators, and what we found is what they're missing. They've got tens of thousands of machine learning engineers. They've got open source transformers now that are changing the world, but what they're missing is analysis, research, and understanding of humanity, because that's essentially the solution to the crisis we face, and I think long-term to the development of more intentional information ecosystem.
And just to follow up on that, what stops them creating teams of people like Kinzen, like there is in other parts of the world, folks such as Catherine's team, who inform and provide signals for those models? Why do they not do that?
As journalism has its functional technology illiteracy, technology has its disdain and derision of journalism, right? And again, to your point earlier on, everything can be solved with an algorithm. And I have to say, the last 4 years have been a really bad time for relationships between people who work in technology platforms and journalism, because it has been a siege mentality. And there are good people. I would describe them as a kind of an insurgency within the platforms who are doing things like, for example, at Twitter, where we have now the beginnings of friction and labeling and really effective results coming from applying a bit of friction on stuff that's going around the systems, and that is based on cutting-edge research. So I think what's stopping the platforms from really making radical change is that, for example, the third most spoken language on the planet is Hindi, and until very recently there was no machine learning classifier to detect misinformation for that language in Meta, according to Frances Haugen. So that is what's stopping them. They don't fundamentally understand the nuances, and also don't want to take a decision which exposes them to a liability for deciding what constitutes misinformation, disinformation, hateful content. And I think the final part then is that, if all you have is a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And their systems are built right now to systematically drive people to feel emotions so they can make money off advertising.
I mean, you've each talked about the way that artificial intelligence and machine learning can scale some of these responses that each of you have had to the information crisis. Whether that is matching claims or checking domains or creating these databases of information to enable platforms. I mean, what is the kind of core limitations of it? What do you get frustrated by? What when you're working in teams of people who are kind of putting this technology to work? What do you get kind of tear your hair out about, basically? Laura?
Well, many things. We try to remain optimistic, but as an optimist, I would love to see the machines help us to uplift public discourse. So, you talk about content moderation, that there is so much that we could be doing, and nobody's really designed this kind of stuff in yet, but, could we find new ways to let people have conversations that are a bit more wholesome? I don't know how many of you have been on, some of the anti-vax threads that you see, with people just punching each other out repeatedly for kind of, 400 posts. It's really dispiriting, and it's actually quite damaging to anybody's mental health reading through a lot of that. Wouldn't it be great if we could find ways to have better conversations? And I genuinely think that's something that we could work with the platforms on, the broadcasters, the organisations such as yourselves. We could look at ways to try to get that debate a bit more wholesome and a bit more healthy. So it kind of frustrates me that that this is a really difficult thing to do. And the conversation I always have with our wonderful data scientists, and they are brilliant, is, why don't we do this? And they go, well, can we just this is hard stuff to do. There's people out there who are kind of, they're optimizing for eyeballs. That's hard enough. We're trying not to. We're trying to optimize for other stuff, but that's even harder because nothing really exists out there very little exists out there that does that. So I think we're in a kind of a discovery phase. I really hope that we can come out the other end of it with some real positives around using this tremendously powerful technology and these tremendously powerful platforms with our brilliant kind of, trusted journalism to make sure that people do have access to both great content and debate around it, because that's what's missing at the moment.
Mark, do you have the same conversations with your machine learning engineers?
No, because what I found, and found it with Storyful as well, and actually on Twitter, is when you get technologists, engineers on one side of a spectrum, right, and you get journalists on the other end of a spectrum. Journalists are like, oh, look, the shiny thing. And engineers want to get down with headphones on and solve the problem. When you put them together and start talking to each other, this kind of sublime thing happens where the journalist will say, so you've just detected a neo-Nazi network using an alias of a word they're using to evade detection. And the engineer turns around and goes, yeah, I've just detected a neo-Nazi network. And it's like, and there's that holy shit moment that comes from engineers and journalists talking together and achieving results and getting practical results. Where the limitations are, I think, for all of us is really in data and diversity of data. So the first thing I say is language. So, for example, there's 23 languages, I think, that account for the world's population, half the world's spoken world population, but there are hundreds more. And the complexities of languages like Arabic, where we have, we've got one spoken language with 3 or 4 different types of the language, and then multiple different dialects, and then we have a phonetic culture where a lot of words are in the speaking of the word and the accent. So that was the machine breaking down. So, it's a very rich, fertile place for us to go as editorial and journalistic exercises, but I think it's very, very difficult for machine learning unless you can create data sets that reflect the diversity, the linguistic diversity, the culture of a country, and that's where we can play the role. The final thing I would say is then, in machine learning, we have to adopt the phrase, nothing about us without us. I'm 52 years old, I'm white, cis, I live in Dublin, Ireland. Who am I to say what a hateful slur is against a transphobic teenager in Detroit or in London? And so for me, it's finding ways that we can watch the way language is evolving as a weapon. And I think that's going to be involving people like me, I hope, in terms of leading this change. But really, in the end of the day, how do we get people to be involved in technology systems that essentially have been designed without them?
I want to come back to that point around kind of data ethics and inputs, basically. But Catherine, I'm going to come to you just on the limitations question. What kinds of challenges do you see as far as pairing human intelligence with artificial intelligence? Is there a different set of challenges on the continent of Africa? You know, what are you seeing?
I think what Mark has said is very relevant when it comes to language, as well as what kind of data is being used to train these algorithms or whatever it is. I mean, if you're not, let me just give you an example. Twitter just picks out English words. It doesn't pick out, for example, hateful speech or even misinformation or even very, I don't know how I would call it, very provocative or insightful statements that have been made in Swanglish, which is Kiswahili English, because Twitter doesn't know it. But there's no database of offensive words in that language. There's no, I mean, for me, it just frustrates me. Sorry, I sound, but it's because I really get frustrated when we have these conversations and the whole thing about how we can use AI to solve all our big problems. But AI and all this machine learning is only good if we can give it a wide enough, a diverse enough database and a very comprehensive and very robust database to be able to understand even the nuances. And for me, what really frustrates me even more is when us humans find there is a problem and we point it out to the platforms or to the tech companies and they do nothing. Because then they say, oh, we can only pull down something if it was recommended to us by one of our fact-checking partners. And you're like, wait a minute. The longer you leave it on, the more it's being spread and the more damage it can do offline. So there's always that kind of concern. And I remember, I think one of the most obvious one I think everybody remembers is when Twitter all of a sudden decided they're going to shut down or to pull down a tweet by the Nigerian president because they said it somehow, according to Twitter, was in contravention of its community rules. And the rest of us were asking, what about all the nonsense that was being said by some president in some first world or whatever country it was, because that's where they come from. And nothing happened. But when they did that, it just goes to show there seems to be applying double standards when it comes to, or rather the algorithms did not understand the context or the nuance in which it was being, the statements made by the president was being made, and the action by the platforms to say we are going to believe what our algorithm has said and we hold true to what we said, and it took 7 months for them to kind of get back, Twitter to be allowed back in Nigeria. But it's this kind of disconcerting or deliberate ignorance or neglect of half the world, as it were, or more than half the world, because we don't all speak English. Africa speaks more than 2,000 languages, and I know it's a big problem. But you can imagine how many people are not being, or rather Twitter, and I don't just mean Twitter, but how many people are not being attended to or are not being served, or we are neglecting just because of an issue of language. We are not putting our resources and we are not trying to build robust enough databases to encourage our own within Africa or anywhere else where we have this problem of language as an issue, where we are not able to help build up those databases that can then help build intelligent AIs, inclusive AIs, so that I don't feel I don't belong in these spaces. I belong to them, but I am right now always having to struggle to push myself to be seen, as it were.
That's very powerful, Catherine. Can I follow up on that, and can you expand upon your engagement with the platforms? Because I would have thought that after the revelations in the Facebook files that we saw last year, the mismatch in terms of the languages that these platforms utilize, the revenue that they spend on English mainly versus all of the other languages in the rest of the world, I would have expected them to be banging on your door to help them with this challenge. Can you talk a little bit to that engagement with them?
Yeah, well, for example, has supported and is supporting PesaCheck in terms of helping, supporting its debunk, and it's because of Facebook that PesaCheck, the initiative, has grown to almost 12 countries in Africa. The main languages are English and French, obvious, and Kiswahili. But unfortunately, again, the focus on getting Swahili fact-checking as has not been given that kind of prominence as English and French. They are, and PesaCheck has managed to do and is still doing fact-checking in Amhara and Oromo and Tigrinya, the three main languages in Ethiopia, but mainly in Amhara. But again, we are talking about human beings, not machines. So how many can the fact checkers, who are maybe 5, how much misinformation can they actually be reasonably expected to kind of debunk, and how can it be shared, obviously within the Amhara or the Tigrinya Facebooks or Twitter, they can share that there, but it's very, the limitation not just the language, but also in terms of building the kind of databases such that, for example, you have this WhatsApp hotline that PesaCheck uses and people send tips and then you need to debunk it. But most of the time the WhatsApp, the messages or the claims are not in English, they're in some different language. Again, you need to build a robust enough database that we as journalists or anybody who's interested in fighting this, pushing back against the misinformation or this kind of stuff, anybody who's interested, and even educating the public on what is and what isn't, how can we build those kind of robust databases such that people can actually make reference to them? But now it's only maybe 1,000 fact checks. In Kiswahili, maybe not. And how many? We need more. And it's not only in Kiswahili. So there's the whole language thing, but also how do we train these algorithms to be able to understand, such that when I say, like Kenya, we're going into an election, when I see madoadoa in a tweet, I need to kind of take a step back and look at it. In what context was that word used? Madoadoa means sports. Especially at this time when you talk about madoadoa, people take it to mean it's hate speech, and it's also in a sense identifying either a community or somebody to be removed or to be dealt with. So in a way, you just feel we are always trying to deal with the fallout, and we don't have enough to work on in terms of what can we do. We can, right now I know there are quite a number of organizations, academicians, and all the rest, academics, trying to build up this kind of glossary of words which we can then try and push to Twitter and other platforms and tell them, in this context, this is what it means, so that they can then train their machine. But how long would that take? And nobody's giving you that kind of support. So it's how do you say, trying to hold up the roof of the house, although your hands are getting very tired and you have to pull one hand down to rest the other one, but then you know it will fall down. So it's a bit of a challenge in that way.
Yeah, I can very much sense your frustration. But it's interesting to talk about, journalists and the teams that we work with as basically creators of database and linguists foremostly, right? That's a really interesting idea. I want to go back to the question of the creation of these data sets, the training of models that happens as a result of a number of different ways and means. But how do your organizations kind of counter against the potential bias that can be introduced into those machine learning models and classifiers, Mark?
So we're very influenced by what broadly is called human-in-the-loop systems, which I know is going to be much abused in the future and will be losing its meaning. But for what now is the case of medical diagnostics, for example, where critical judgment is critical, like life or death, where vast amounts of data are being analyzed. And at every stage, the human is there to tweak the algorithm, see the result, tweak it, say it's wrong or not. So we were very inspired by this approach. And I think to Catherine's question, if you're trying to fix one of these problems, you're basically going to lose completely. So if you think about it as workflows, separate but connected. We started out a couple of years back being asked to analyze text, audio, video content for political extremism leading up to the 2020 election. So we started as journalists and said, right, we have a very big idea who's really responsible for this stuff. So we used natural language processing to analyze transcripts for the objectionable content that we knew, our own little internal dysopedia, as we called it, right? All the bad words. And then out of that, we realized the transcription wasn't doing a great job. We had to tweak it a little bit more. So the editor was coming in to tweak the words. So we were getting words like beverage, which for alcohol in England is, we wouldn't know what that would be. So little things we were tweaking. And then we were realizing as a language was, with diaspora communities like Latino people who were talking in a different way. So all the research that was being done was being using better transcription models, narrative models, language models, just constantly improving that. Meanwhile, over the other hand, with detection, we've got 500 hours of YouTube video uploaded every minute, 1.2 million new podcasts last year alone, right? How do you analyze that? So we start thinking about that, and vast quantities would require machine learning transformers, which were open source in 2017. What this really is like going from a mainframe computer in a big room to a personal computer. It is giving the power of ML to small teams based in places like Dublin. And now that's where the data gets really important. So if we can find, with Catherine's help, constantly iterating, watching for the evasion of the algorithm by extremist groups who are always changing their language. Like last year, the anti-vaxxers were talking about panini, meaning the pandemic, because they knew if they said pandemic, they'd be detected by the algorithm. So we're constantly tuning the algorithm with new words, and then the algorithm's coming back and going, is that word similar to that word? Yes, it is, or no, it's not. And again, you can see how the fine-tuning of this process. Now take the big detection model, put it into the software that we use for research, and now this feedback loop gets exponentially better and better and better. And then we make the next jump, which is not just words, but forms of language, semantic similarity, claim matching. Now in all of this, the machine gets it wrong, but never can you let a human being be too far away at that critical junction when it gets it wrong. That does not stop bias. It doesn't account for diversity. We've got to constantly watch out for that. I don't think we're there yet, but at least having the human at every critical stage of this process, from generating the training data to watching the aliases and the claim matching, it's a wonderful process. And I'm not getting ahead of myself here when I say this couldn't have happened 4 years ago. So if we look back in journalism and information quality, we all think about things like paywalls and success in the New York Times and all the things that happened in journalism. Probably we will look back on the open sourcing of machine learning transformers in 2017 as being a landmark moment for journalism. And that's one of the things I think that I'm very hopeful right now. And again, I'm an optimist, but guarded.
And I just want to push you on the question of, the kind of checks and balances.
Yeah.
When would you know that something has gone wrong? Because there was a story that The Verge published last week about a Facebook recommendation system. You might have seen it. It took months, I think 8 months, before they realized that something had gone wrong and that this recommendation system in their product had been recommending the complete opposite content that it was meant to.
Yeah.
How do you in your small team counter that?
So we're working with a lot of people. We have about 40 people around the world, with good chunk of those being machine learning engineers, some being basically journalists, and then we have a data labeling team. And that data labeling team is really where we're saying, well, that word, what level of harm is that word at? So that we have internal processes by which we will analyze that. And obviously, I don't think in the example you used, there would be a journalist constantly priming and checking and doing those checks and seeing the aliases coming out. But you do raise an issue, which is a lot of the problems that are not happening in the way we detect or research these problems. It's in the content moderation decision making, where we have a lot of opaque, unaccountable kind of decisions being made. But I would say, from I work with these platforms, there's a lot of things besides taking content down that are being experimented with. Labeling. Can we get better at automatically telling someone that there's a piece of context for this information that's vitally important, like we're labeling, Russian state media, but adding a piece of context, or then speed bumps, friction, circuit breakers. We might see a trend that we don't know what it is okay, well, don't put it into the recommender system, keep it out, or just stop it while we analyze it further. And some of these things that are happening, demonetization, looking at the ad systems, there's a lot of stuff going on right now that I think is very hopeful. Thank you.
Great. Laura, how does your team at the BBC also, have these circuit breakers? At what point do you delve in and kind of query what's there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I mean, what Mark's described so brilliantly is the amplification sort of nature of this. This stuff scales, at what you're doing really quickly, which can be fantastic or it can be terrifying depending on, which flip of the coin you're going on. I think the human in the loop stuff for us, it's super important to keep journalists in the loop. So we're building what we call business rules into our recommenders, so that, for example, we're not recommending content that's legally difficult sitting next to content, so you've not got an arrest and a charge on the same page, which obviously a machine could quite easily do. So there's things like that we have to think about, but much more than that and much deeper than that. How do we want to use humans in the mix when we're curating that content? What is the right mix of that content that we're putting out there? And our research shows that we're a bit surprised at this. People don't want personalization to the level that they're not having a shared experience. They want a shared experience with other people that says, these are the top stories of the day. I don't know if you have the same urge I do when I go onto a news app. I want to see what people, what is the top story? What does the BBC think? What does ITV think? What does CNN think? And people value that. Even if they might not agree, they value that shared experience. And we've got to be very careful we don't lose that in the mix of all this wonderful kind of array of content that we can push people. They want that at the second level, but they want a shared experience too. So I think that's something we're really thinking about. I'm fascinated to hear what Mark's talking about with this linguistic work, because one of the things that I think this really captures is the notion of intent. So, there are things that people have pushed at them by accident, and there are things that are very, very intentional. They're coming from people who have a specific desire to push content for whatever reason, for many reasons. And finally, I just want to say, Catherine, we're sending you so many virtual muscles to help you hold up that ceiling, because the work you're doing is incredible. And, I just want to give a big shout out and say, how much we support and love what you're doing, and we should talk about it, because I'd love to hear more about that offline as well. Thank you.
Great. So we're getting to the point where we're going to hopefully invite you guys to ask questions of the panel and to also make some comments, because I'm sure we have some experts in the audience here. I want to kind of just flip the question a little bit, and we've talked about how the mix of human intelligence and machine learning can be difficult at times, and some of the tasks where you don't want it to be necessarily working. But where can we use this mix that we're not currently using it in journalism? Are there tasks, you talked, Laura, about, comments and maybe, nudges for a better conversation? What are the things that we're not thinking about where we can bring, humans and technology together in this way? I'll start with you.
So I think the nudging thing is at an early stage. We've been doing a couple of experimental things, and I'm going to just shout out an organisation called the Partnership on AI, who've been thinking about this with us for quite a long time, and is sort of drawing together communities of people who are trying to use AI for good, which is just such a brilliant organisation to be involved with. I think it is still really hard, and I think some of the effort and the energy that we're putting into machine learning and AI is going down another route, which is saving journalists who can then spend time thinking about this, time on other tasks. So, for example, there's a brilliant piece of work, nothing to do with disinformation or well, sort of linguistics, but which is helping our producers sift through hours and hours of material. Now, this will have huge applications in news, but we're using it on our Spring Watch program. So when you've got loads of birds nesting in nest boxes, you never thought you'd hear that, did you? We can sort of track them, and we can find out, which is the woodpecker, what's the woodpecker doing, how many times has it visited the nest, and it saves an enormous amount of time. Now, translate that into a news environment, and if you've got cameras watching particular events, you've suddenly freed up a journalist to do whatever you might want them to be doing. That might be fact-checking, it might be writing stories. So there are huge benefits that we're seeing all the time. It's just pulling them together and making sure that we keep a really close eye on what the unintended consequences might be. So far, none with the woodpeckers, thankfully.
And I think what Laura's talking is really exciting about the idea of letting people feel a sense of shared identities, right? So I always think about personalization, like if you think about personalization, it says, well, someone living in the same town kind of has the same news feed. I don't know about you, but if you live next to your neighbor who's 26 years old and is clubbing every weekend compared to the family next door, I mean, their news has to be totally different. Their place, their profession, their passions, And so I love the idea that personalization can give us a concept of having a part of a shared reality in which we all accept there's shared facts, and then go off into our areas where there is our identities, the complex identity of people, not one identity, but like the lots of different things that define us, the beauty of serendipity. Like my biggest shock I remember once inside a tech platform was saying they had a list of the data points they had for all human emotion. And I asked, what about serendipity? The moment when you actually hear a new idea, something you didn't expect. And they were, well, we don't really optimize for that. Whereas I think if you think about that, that's one of those things you could be optimizing for with the right kind of recommendation system. I also think in terms of decentralization of the powers of content moderation. Right now, they're in black boxes. They're very, secretive, and they kind of have to be for the moment. But what about in future? If you could actually set your preferences to, for example, hear different ideas, or your tolerance for, hearing people who might be a little bit incendiary, or just turn that off. So I do feel as we go forward, the decentralization of powers to individual, which I think will be part of personalization, will, I think, get us over this free speech dichotomy we have right now, whereas, detecting content to take it down, and maybe giving people more. I'd love to see, for example, creators given the power to make their space, their community, protected. And then that could be monetized at a higher rate than an unprotected space. So essentially, brands want to only go places where there is safety. What if we could use, some of this technology to allow people to create safer spaces that could monetize at a higher rate? That would obviously include journalists, but a wide range of influencers and people right now that are doing incredible work in the creator economy. And I'd love, and I think platforms would much rather do that than have tens of thousands of people who are low paid and sometimes not very well trained to make snap decisions about content. And I think that's the future for me. The final thing I would say is I admire the work of Journalism AI at LSE. I was talking to Charlie Beckett and Matthias yesterday, and they said when they started out, they thought they were going to try to find journalists who had radical new breaking ideas about, but actually it was about process and management. And that's why Laura's work I find amazing, to be inside an organization that is by definition an institution and just get it into the workflow. Like remember when computers came into newsrooms and we had computer journalism and electronic news gathering, and now it's there as part of the furniture. So I'd love to see AI not looked upon as magic, but part of the process where you walk in and you expect this as part of your workflow.
And I would just shout out a case study that Journalism AI have done, which is one of the favorites of mine, where a Swedish public broadcaster basically personalized by asking editors to rank stories for their evergreenness and for their importance. So on top of the things that we personalize content for, they were asked to apply scores which were then used to then serve these stories in apps and in different recommendation systems. And apparently that has gone very well. I'm hoping going to catch up with them about that. But it's not very sexy. It's the kind of smart, and it makes sense and it's simple, but it's not in the realms of the imagination. Catherine, I'm just going to come to you on that question, if that's possible. What would you like to see kind of artificial intelligence used for in your work? Where are we not using it that we could be?
I think for me, I would see a lot more in terms of the area of trying to reduce the inequality, gender inequality, especially when it comes to the newsroom, when it comes to distribution of tasks and news content, and making sure that we get a good balance when it comes to content on women. And then the other thing I was also thinking in terms of audio, because we are listening to everywhere we are going now. It's not podcasts only, but I'm thinking in terms of audio, text and audio, maybe using AI, obviously with getting enough to be able to translate into our own languages, not English. By the way, when I'm talking, I'm not thinking in terms of English, because there's a lot already done in English, and everybody's talking AI, it's in English, and so you know what I mean. But I'm thinking here in terms of attempts or efforts by some of our very interesting young people in Africa who are trying to come up with their own, or come up with something similar to Google Translate, and machine learning that can, or language, what do they call it? The natural language learning processes, whatever that, NLP, whatever. and basically trying to be able to translate audio which is in English into our local language, which means we have more access to information beyond our own whatever, and means we can be able to share that. It's, for me, if it happens, I think it will be at least one big step in terms of utilizing these technologies for good, because I think if we can crack that particular nut where we are able to actually bridge this gap that exists right now when it comes to utilization of these technologies in our continent or in our context, then for me that is the one thing I would say.
Very interesting.
Or rather, there are two things. It's gender, and then, of course, using audio text. That would be something very, very exciting, because I think everybody now is into podcasting and everything. But it's not so much that, but understanding that a lot of us are still dependent on radio to get our information, or to spread rumors. If you want to spread them, do it on radio or whatever. Anyway, that's for me for a bit.
That's why it's so important to have your perspective here, Catherine. I'm very glad to have you on the panel. Over to the audience, please, with questions, if you have any. I'll report them for the stream in case the noise doesn't carry. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? Yeah.
In terms of content recommendation and personalization, obviously as a commercial news organization, there is the danger or potential to feed the confirmation bias of the reader, because that will work. So what do you see as either best practices in place or strategies that you think of yourself to counter that, and to also have attractive personalization strategies, recommendation strategies that don't just feed confirmation bias of the readers?
Yeah, so the question was, what strategies are there, would you kind of recommend for avoiding confirmation bias in things like kind of content moderation? So I'll start with you on that, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, we started out building a publisher product that essentially was trying to solve that problem, which was to say that the user could set their preferences, and obviously the personalization is going to look at, you know, what they're doing, their first-party data, their behavior. So sending them things that we know they're looking at and engaging with, but also with an understanding where there are gaps. And so we were using and thinking a lot about the Fitbit, we have an app for everything right now. We control so many aspects of our lives, from our diet to our exercise. Why couldn't we think about recommendation systems in a similar way? So we could point out that you say you want to know more about the war in Ukraine, but actually, you know, you were looking at Celebrity Bake Off or whatever it may be. You know, and again, not a scold, but these prompts. And this is what I think AI, and I think AI itself is probably such a overused or a vague way here, but I think these assisted recommendation systems can do a lot to give us that kind of nudge. I was knocked out by work done on heuristics. Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, if you know who they are, they analyzed what the bias is in our brains, you know, when we buy something or believe something. And I really do feel that the nudge theory that's emerged out of behavioral economics is very important in the way we design recommendation systems, to remind us of something, to nudge us toward an outcome that we already said we wanted. That, for me, is the dream. But again, maybe we're a long way from there. I know it's practical reality.
We're a long way, but you've just taken me back with great affection to one of the first bits of thinking that the BBC did around this, which was about a word which I'd never heard before, surprisal, which was a kind of serendipity. And it came from one of our data scientists who's now left, Magda Pitkaska, who's absolutely fantastic. And it made me think, and she said to me that every time you give somebody a choice which is not an obvious choice, so if you like motor racing, you know, we could give you loads of it, you know, and you'd probably consume a lot of it. But if we said, actually, no, there's something else we want to give you, every time you do that, there's an opportunity for somebody to go, ooh, you know, I might drop out then, because that's weird. Why have they given me that? So it's a high-risk strategy. We have to find a way of making it work at the right level. So you're giving people enough stuff that they think is useful on those onward journeys and perhaps predictable, and then just some other things that might be those nudges, and that might be, you know, something which continues to entertain and delight you, and that's the word we use in our data lab team, find stuff that will delight you, but might not be something that you would automatically expect. Because you're right, I mean, there was such fascinating stuff done about, you know, the incredible sort of rabbit holes that people were taking down on some personalized systems, which were really quite, you know, quite harmful. And we really want to avoid that. We did a big sort of case study where we were looking at suicide content, and you can imagine the awful outcomes if, you know, you keep feeding people with content that you think they're interested in because they've been reading, stuff like that, eating disorders similarly. So there are huge dangers here, there are huge potential harms. There are also huge benefits, I think, if we get it right. And it is a really tricky one, and you're going to need to, you know, as Mark referred to before, keep tuning and keep watching those algorithms and make sure that, you know, the unintended consequences are not popping in, but that you are kind of giving people a, you know, what Magda would have called a really healthy diet with some salad in it. You know, that sounds terribly BBC and patriarchal, I'm so sorry, but you know, the general sort of idea is just to try to give people something which is delightful and yet not predictable.
I was very struck when I was a political journalist in the United States for a while, and I covered US elections. I remember going to Iowa to this diner where there was, the mayor told me that, I said, how do people choose the right presidential candidate? They've seen everybody. And he said, they want someone just like them, but better. And I always think that's what I dream of as a recommender system, right? You know, the person in your friend group who always gives you the good recommendation on movies, but they never listen to them if they're talking about, you know, music. And in my sense, that's where studies have shown the key part of trust is benevolence, that someone has your back. You tend to believe people who you know have your best interest at heart. And in many ways, I think that's what the perfect recommendation system looks like. Someone like you, but a little better. And for me, I think that's where there's going to be so much exciting things to be explored, because, you know, we've broken everything, right? So in some ways, what I get excited by is we're like ground zero again.
Catherine, does that keep you up at night, the idea of kind of confirmation biases? I know you're probably a bit further away as far as some of the technology is concerned, but does that worry you?
Well, in a way, because what happens is that if it is stuff that has no, if I keep on receiving the same kind of menu, I'll get malnourished, sorry to say. But on the other hand, I also have this problem where if it is a machine, sorry to use the word machine, if it is an algorithm recommending or a bot recommending something else, I am less likely, just because I do not, just because it's, I mean, understanding that that bot or that algorithm has learned what to recommend to me based on information which has got nothing at all to do with me in terms of selection, So I'm most likely not to take on what I'm recommended to by a bot or by an algorithm. I would rather, when Laura tells me this is what is happening, I trust her more, because understanding that the basis of this algorithm has not taken into account my own self, not as an individual, but does not understand where I'm coming from. It's not situated in my life, if you know what I mean. Because that information it's learning from has got very little to do with us or with me and where I am at and what my circumstances are. So I really don't get concerned by that personally, because I don't follow, I try and follow what another human being tells me than a machine, in this case, recommendations by a bot or being allowed, being only seeing stuff that has been recommended to me by either platform or whatever it is. I tend to go out and look for it myself, so that I don't get this malnourishment based on the stuff that gets fed to you by an algorithm that seems to believe that it knows you better than you yourself or your friends. Sorry to be so convoluted, but I hope it makes sense.
I like the idea of nourishment as a word.
Can I just speak? Can I just speak? Because I think that's absolutely brilliant, and I also think it's a really important point that you make there, Catherine, which is that some people don't want personalisation, and they should be allowed to opt out. We should be able to say to people, if you don't want us to track you and give you content that we think you're going to like, you have the right to do that, because I think, you know, it could be something that people do feel is quite intrusive, and, you know, understandably, there's a brilliant phrase that's used when collaborative filtering is used, which is, you know, I'm being discriminated at by association. So because I'm being looked at in the context of what other people like me have consumed, you know, therefore I'm being kind of almost offered stuff against my will, sort of thing. So I think we have to be really careful of that. It's a brilliant framing, and you know, thank you to Catherine for saying that, because I think it's really important.
I think we can probably squeeze in one more question if we have it. Otherwise, I'll just finish with the reflection I think you shared with me, Mark, that people will rally against these recommendation systems anyway, and against these models that are powering our recommendation systems. So Mark's daughter is gaming the TikTok algorithm by watching videos over and over again in order to train it to provide her with more of that content. And she's how old, Mark?
17.
So if you're not getting that content you want, if you're not getting nourished, as Catherine says, people will find a way around it. And that's probably the best example of that we can probably have today of humans.
But I think
and
the
machine.
awareness, the point Laura's makes, like, I just want to be aware you're doing this to me. That's what's problematic for me, is so much of our lives are unconscious, and learned helplessness is the biggest recipe for distrust of a media system, and we kind of have that at the moment. So awareness of what's happening, like until recently, I remember my daughter when she was younger, well, my friends recommend the content to me. No, your friends don't. That friends is an algorithm. No, it's not. Now she's the one training the algorithm.
Brilliant. What a nice moment to kind of end on. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you for your inputs. Thank you, Catherine, for joining us, and to the panel, if you give me a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. It's great.
The friction thing as well is the one thing we didn't say is about how much friction people want. Because we assume they would don't want any, and I think that's actually
Hi, how you doing?
people might want to invest.
Yeah.
No.
Cool.
Oh, fantastic.
Thank you.
This to you both. I'm doing a story about the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency.
Oh, yeah.